Tekken 8 is the latest installment in the long-running Tekken franchise, and arguably one of the best yet. After finding success with the 7th entry, the development team went crazy and packed this new game full of every mode and option you could imagine. It's an absolute blast to play, whether you're looking for competitive play or over-the-top single-player content. It's also the first big fighting game built using the latest generation of Unreal technology. As such, unlike Street Fighter 6 or Mortal Kombat 1, which at least had a Switch version, Tekken 8 is a game only available on current generation platforms. So, how does it fare? We already got a taste of the game on PlayStation 5 back in our preview, but now I've spent time enjoying it on Series X and S, as well as the PC. So today we'll go through these different versions, we'll talk about the visuals, the gameplay, the PC options, including all 17 of its different upscaling solutions. I also have recommended settings for playing on the Steam Deck, and an entire section on input lag testing, and more. So let's get into it. The Tekken series has always been known for its exceptionally sharp presentation, smooth frame rates, and a huge selection of features. If you had a PlayStation back in the 90s, you very likely had a copy of Tekken 3, a game which redefined what a fighting game could be on a home console thanks to its copious amount of modes and content. Namco was also there on PlayStation 2 with the stunning Tekken Tag Tournament, which, like Soul Calibur for Dreamcast before it, amped up the visuals and number of features to the max. This was in turn followed up with a pair of sequels that pushed the series in two different directions. And then there was Tekken 6, which is a good game, but it marked a low point in the series in terms of consumer interest. So when Tekken 7 exploded onto the scene, becoming one of the most popular fighting games in history, arguably anyways, it set the stage for the 8th entry. And so here we are today. After the delightfully over-the-top introduction sequence, a Tekken series staple, you're dropped into the main menu that is absolutely packed with modes and options, perhaps more than any fighting game I've played to date even. You have a story-driven single-player mode packed with cutscenes and over-the-top action. You have the arcade quest mode, which has you traveling around to fictional arcades competing in Tekken 8. There's character stories, the arcade mode, practice modes, online lobbies, and more. And even things like a complete soundtrack jukebox for every game in the franchise, which can be assigned to specific stages. Something we also saw in Tekken 7, but it's been improved here. It's honestly awe-inspiring to see this much stuff in a single game. Now, visually speaking, Tekken 8 builds on the 7th entry with a focus on the grungy, hyper-detailed aesthetic. Characters are chiseled, yet boast exaggerated features and clothing designed to emphasize their individual styles. In some ways, it can even feel a little too busy at times for my tastes, but I think the overall model quality is a significant step up from Tekken 7. Rounder edges, better materials, improved skin shading, and more. For this comparison, we're looking at the PlayStation 4 version of Tekken 7, and while I do think they're somewhat comparable, I think putting them side by side really helps showcase the enhancements. Take this scene with Jin, for instance. Look at his stance and posing. The model in Tekken 7 almost feels slightly wider, as if his personal aspect ratio was a little off. Couple that with the superior skin shading, character lighting, texture work, and better cloth in Tekken 8, and it just looks better all around. I also feel that his character is better integrated into the background itself, which also holds true for Kazuya on the other side of the arena. Plus, while the backgrounds are obviously different, they look significantly better in Tekken 8 as well. And of course, the same holds true for Asuka in this other scene. They're using different outfits here, mind you, but the overall scene lighting and integration into the scene feels a lot better in Tekken 8. And the same is true of Kazuya here on the right, who appears to almost have this glow in Tekken 7 in comparison, and given the comparable conditions with the bright blue sky and sunlight, I think it's a pretty fair comparison. And this is really consistent throughout the game. There's just more detail everywhere you look, lending it an overall richer appearance. But more importantly, Tekken 8 is obviously no longer limited by older consoles. You see, Tekken 7 maxes out at 1080p on a PS4 Pro, but if you were playing on Xbox One or Xbox One X even, it remains stuck at just 720p. It never got a 1X patch. Tekken 8 in comparison is of course much sharper, at least on most platforms. Which is where we get into that part of the video, the console comparisons. The good news here though is that it plays very well at 60 frames per second on every machine, but there are some caveats. But before we get to that, let's talk about something that benefits every version, the loading times. You see, this was always a problem with games like Tekken 7. Loading between matches took way too long and became annoying. With Tekken 8 though, we're basically back to that pre-disc era in terms of loading speeds. There's just enough time to play out the animation followed by a quick jump right into the game. It may seem like a minor thing on the surface, but going in and out of matches is something you do constantly in a fighting game, and if it takes too long, it can be frustrating. So all these new machines with their SSDs and faster CPUs make a gigantic difference. Beyond that though, the three consoles boast largely similar visual settings, while the PC of course offers more tweakable options. Both PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X then use Unreal's dynamic resolution scaler with a maximum resolution of native 4K with a minimum 50% scale on both axes. In reality, they both hang closer to 1440p, well, slightly above actually, but I found that the Series X generally boasts a higher resolution than PS5 if you stop and look at them in similar situations, so there is an advantage in favor of Series X, but it's very slight. The Series S then targets 1080p as a ceiling, but unfortunately it seems to drop to 720p or even lower than that, leading to image quality that's much more in line with Tekken 7 on the Xbox One. All versions use TAA combined with what seems to be a spatial upscaler. Now Tekken 8 includes multiple such options on PC, and that includes AMD FSR1, which does seem to be the closest match in this case. I suspect they're not using FSR2, as when this is used in the PC version, disocclusion artifacts can become rather noticeable, especially at lower resolutions. Before we dive into that PC version though, I want to talk about the console visual differences. While PS5 and Series X look effectively identical, the Series S version is a visual step down, at least in terms of texture detail. I suspect this is due to the smaller memory pool, but basically it means that some surfaces, such as these white lines here, appear rather low resolution. They're basically using the lowest possible texture setting, and it is noticeable. The game still looks good overall, mind you, but the low resolution and blurry textures means it doesn't stack up well against its bigger brother. Still, again, all three consoles perfectly managed to hit their 60 frames per second target. There are no issues with performance, and it feels great to play, so even if you take a visual hit on the Series S, it's still a solid version. But okay, let's talk PC. So for this video, I tested it both on my powerful desktop system, on which it ran perfectly, and the Steam Deck OLED. I'll have some suggestions on Steam Deck settings shortly, but the first thing I want to talk about are the detail levels available in the options. There's a lot of settings here, and I wanted to start by comparing the various presets. I'd argue that everything medium and up looks pretty good and is generally comparable. It's only when using the lowest settings that the visuals degrade to the point where I feel it's noticeable. But the bigger question seems to stem from these upscaler and AA options. There's a ton of them available in Tekken 8, including DLSS, FSR2, FSR1, XESS, TAAU, TSR, bicubic upsampling, NVIDIA image scaler, and a resolution scaling slider, plus an option to adjust anti-aliasing quality. When putting them side by side on this moving stage, all three solutions look pretty good. XESS, however, exhibits significant ghosting here on this ribbon tied to the railing. FSR2 also has kind of an issue with the waterline, which makes it look more like a piece of glass rather than a railing. I think DLSS looks the best when using the highest quality option. As you go down the stack though, and use the more performance-related options, especially Ultra Performance, the issues are exacerbated. The one problem here though is that all of these modes use reconstruction, so native res is off the table. And that basically means there's no DLAA support, which is kind of surprising given how many other options are in this game. Thankfully, the slider does become available for other settings, and that includes the best one, Unreal's TSR. If you combine TSR with 100% resolution scale, which in this case is native 4K, you get the best possible image quality in Tekken 8. There's minimal artifacts, you get the sharpest edges, and the cleanest visuals. So if you have the hardware headroom, this is the option you want to go with. Keep this in mind because by default, most of the presets opt for FSR1 like the consoles, which is okay enough, but it adds some distracting sharpening. The lowest preset then goes for bicubic upsampling, which hey, is nice as an option. But what about the Steam Deck? Well, firstly, I did have some issues running this pre-release, but that was solved by using Proton GE, thankfully. Once in the game though, it quickly becomes apparent that adjustments are needed to the settings. It's a demanding game. Tekken 8 basically requires a frame rate of 60 frames per second to play optimally, so it was time to make adjustments. And this is what I found. Firstly, you'll need to adjust the rendering resolution to between 60 and 70%. Then you'll need to find a nice balance between medium and low settings. I found that medium shadows and post effects were basically a requirement, as disabling these two specifically has a negative impact on the presentation. Now in capture, this footage looks pretty dire I suppose, but on the deck screen itself, it's honestly pretty impressive, especially with HDR enabled on the Steam Deck OLED. And even better, it manages to hold 60 frames per second almost all the time, with just an occasional dip here or there. But one of the most important settings you need to check is TSR. Given that lowering the rendering resolution is necessary to hit 60 frames per second, I found that TSR was the only one that could provide decent image quality while doing this. It's slightly heavier, but I think it's worth it. Using bicubic, the TAAU, or FSR1 produces really bad results. Just look how blurry and nasty the game looks with these settings. This is the same resolution scale here. This game really sold me on the benefits of using Epic's TSR feature. It's a gigantic upgrade over TAAU and a significant improvement over FSR2 as well. And yeah, as I noted, it is slightly more expensive indeed, but it's absolutely the right choice here when you need to render at a lower resolution. Tekken 8 is certainly not too big for Steam Deck, which is great news for everyone. The PC version has another nice bonus hidden in the options menu, and that's motion blur. I know, it's controversial, but I love the way per object motion blur looks in a fighting game, and it's great to see the option here. Curiously, you can use this on the Steam Deck with 0 performance penalty, which makes me wonder why it's not an option in the console versions. When talking about fighting games, however, one of the most important elements ties into input latency. A slow input response can render a version somewhat unplayable, so of course, we needed to determine how responsive Tekken 8 is across each version of the game. But of course, to do that, I wanted to turn to the expert of input latency testing, Nigel Woodall, who has joined us here today.
Thanks for the invite, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, Nigel, you've been testing this game, specifically the demo version, and based on my own testing, comparing the two, the demo and the final game seem to be 100% identical in terms of input latency. So based on this then, let's talk about your results, starting with the basic capture method.
To put it simply, we take the HDMI output from the console, we use a converter to change that into a component signal, we strip away the blue and the red component of that, and then do that at the same time as the button's pressed, and then put it back into an HDMI format and capture that. And that means that we can get very accurate, very precise measurements for 1080p 60 signals and lower resolutions than that, and kind of use that to get quite accurate comparisons between the different versions.
Alright, well that's good then. So one of the things then to consider here is that Tekken 7, when it first launched, was actually as high as like 120 milliseconds, which was pretty bad. But in time, they got it down to, I think you said around 73 milliseconds, which is very good, I think. So what have you found then for Tekken 8?
So the PlayStation 5 version of Tekken 8, running off the demo, came in at around 58 milliseconds. So 58.76 was the exact number I got, but it was very much, it's a great result. It's about as quick as a Tekken game on consoles has ever been.
Yeah, that's right. I noticed this looking at your spreadsheet, where it seems that it is indeed the fastest game in the Tekken series. But okay, that's PS5. What about Xbox?
So I had a look at the Xbox Series X version first. That one was again pretty close. So that was coming in at 57.87. The methods are very accurate, but I think plus or minus a millisecond or so. I don't kind of attach too much importance to that. So I'm happy enough to think that that's pretty much the same as the PlayStation 5 version.
And Series S?
I did have a look at a Series S as well. And that one was coming in at 58.01. And so they're all, in that kind of 58 millisecond ballpark.
Okay, and that is, as you said, basically the best that we've seen from the series as it exists on consoles. But of course, there's also the PC version, and I think you tested that as well?
I did, I had a look at it. So I guess the thing to mention, you can't easily do the PC version with the same testing method. So we use the same program to test it, but we have to use a camera method for this one.
Oh, that's the way I've always done it.
Yep. Yep. So it lets us crunch through a fair few number of results pretty quickly. For this one, we got a result of about 42 milliseconds or so. That's with VSync off on a kind of a G-Sync or a FreeSync VRR compatible screen. So again, that's a significant improvement.
All right, well, thank you, Nigel, for joining us on here. Your feedback and data is always very welcome, so thanks again, Nigel. We're closing in on the end, but there's still a couple things I wanted to briefly mention. Firstly, let's talk about that reveal trailer. Remember this one? Well, while working on the video, I decided to sit down and compare this trailer to the final game. And what I noticed is that some elements appear more visually striking in the trailer, but others seem to work better in the final game. I actually think most of the changes they made, such as the decrease in rain intensity, were done so to improve visibility of the fighters more than anything else. Of course, while making this comparison, I also looked closely at the characters, and it occurred to me that we finally reached a point where the real-time models in this game seem to mostly exceed what we had seen in the pre-rendered cinematics created for older Tekken games. I mean, case in point, when you put it side by side with the original Tekken's full-motion videos, I think it's fair to say that Tekken 8's real-time cutscenes look a little bit better. I mean, yes, the animation in that original CGI is fantastic stuff. It looks extremely realistic, but I think Tekken 8 has finally reached that point. More seriously though, if you fast forward to later games in the series, I actually do think Tekken 8 has pushed beyond what we saw in terms of pre-rendered CGI. Then there's the overall soundscape, which I commented on in the preview, but now that I've had a chance to experience it with my own home theater, I'm even happier. Tekken 8 is an amazing sounding game. Firstly, I was happy to see that it takes full advantage of surround sound. In stages like this, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks amidst the pouring rain adds a ton of ambiance. Sound effects, of course, are more centered and impactful, while the soundtrack, which is just as good as I had hoped, plays out in stereo with the LFE channel helping with a little extra bass. It certainly pumps you up for some Tekken. The smooth transitions keep that energy flowing.
Round 2. Fight! Let's finish this! Round 1. Fight! Round 2. Fight!
Lastly then, there's the game itself. Namco has never made a bad Tekken game, but not all Tekken games are created equally. With the 8th installment, I feel the development team has made one that is good enough to stand alongside my other favorite entries in the series. Yeah, it's still the more cinematic style of Tekken that we saw with the 7th game, but the fighting itself has evolved enough and it feels just extremely fun and satisfying to play. Couple that with the insane number of options and modes, and you're looking at one heck of a packed game. This feels like a Tekken game that could have existed back in the PS2 days, only with a much more modern presentation. It's that darn good. As for which version to play, well, my preference ended up being the PC version, due primarily to broader arcade stick support, Steam Deck support, and the inclusion of features such as motion blur. That said, PS5 and Xbox Series X are also exceptionally well done, and I know there are adapters to play with arcade sticks on these consoles, I just don't have one. Series S, of course, is fine as well, and it does play great, but the visuals take a noticeable hit, so I'm less happy with that version. Still, no matter which version you play, Tekken 8 feels like classic Namco at its best, and for that I am happy. Tekken 8 is a great game. But that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.